let's begin as we have been doing with a quick overview. Quick overview of what happened in today's reading. And as we start to see, there are some real interesting things happening in the plot of today's reading. So Bernard tells Julien, first of all, that he plans to take back France, and particularly that area of France, through the resistance, right? So remembering that France is occupied by the Germans, by the Nazis at this time during the war, and the French resistance is trying to overthrow them. Right? We're also told that there are lots of people who have disappeared. Some of them have been sent to work in labor camps, concentration camps. Some of them have disappeared into the hills, all sorts of different places. So there's lots of people who are gone. And then we also see in this section, we're told that there's a young German soldier who is driving a truck. Right? Originally he was stationed up in the northwest of France, where it was nice and safe, and he hopes that he'll still be safe. He stops at Vaison, the town, and he asks for directions, and just a few miles later, out of town, they find his body. He's been killed, and all of his supplies have been stolen, right? And obviously, it's the work of the French resistance, right? Okay, we then jump to Olivier's time, and we see that Isabelle, she sees the chaos around her. Remember we saw there were all sorts of crazy things people were doing because of the plague, right? So there was particularly the flagellants, like the people who were whipping themselves and thinking, oh, if we show God that we're sorry, that by whipping ourselves that he'll stop the plague, all sorts of things like that. So with all this chaos going on around, Isabelle leaves her house and she goes to the Jewish quarter, which is where Luca Pisano, even though he's not Jewish himself, right, because he's a poor artist, he can't afford to live in a more expensive part of town, so he lives in the Jewish part of town, and she goes to see him, since she is, I don't know if you call it in love or in lust with him. So when she shows up there, who should answer the door but Olivier, because he had spent the night there, right? So he stayed up late talking to his friend, right? The gates of the palace had been locked, so he just said, hey, can I stay here the night? So Olivier lets Isabelle in, and then Olivier, early morning, decides, oh, I'm going home. These crazy Italians, these crazy women, crazy friends, they're all just cause trouble. That's how he says it. Then we see that Pisano and Isabelle, they have their little affair, and she starts walking home through the Jewish quarter, and she's like, oh, this doesn't seem too safe here. And she's right, because a moment later she's stabbed to death. But not by a criminal, but by, well, I guess he kind of is a criminal, but by her husband. Right. We then jump back to Julien's time, and we see that the Germans, right, they obviously are not too happy about their soldier, their driver, having been killed and the supplies stolen. And so, as revenge, instead of just trying to find out who the actual killers were, they just pick up 26 people. First 26 people that they see, they round them up, and they threaten that they're going to put them to death. And one of those 26 people, you might remember the minor character, but nonetheless important character of Elizabeth. She is the wife of the local blacksmith in Vaison. And if you remember, in Rouen, but you remember first of all, she has the affair with Julien, right, earlier in the novel. And then later on, she also talks to Julia at the shrine of Saint Sophia, and she's the one that leaves her the food to consume. So she's one of the ones that is randomly picked up by the Germans. The mayor of the town, who is kind of not really cut out for these kinds of problems, he comes to Julian and he says, like, you know, what can you do? This isn't fair. We can't have people just being killed like this. And everyone in the town kind of knows who it really was, right? Because they know that there are like lots of people who are sort of like would not normally be considered very good citizens, but they have nonetheless found some sort of place during the war by joining up the resistance. So Julian goes to speak to Julia, and he says, well, what should I do? And she says, well, might as well go speak to Marcel. And so he does. He goes to speak to Marcel about the situation, and he also promises to bring back some soap and some paint for Julia, since she is all dirty from her printing and painting and so on. Now we also see that, remember last time in our reading that Julian and Julia had made a deal with Bernard that he would provide like safe passage for Julia out of France if she provided a certain amount of like the forged documents. And even though she's done that and more, right, they still haven't helped her to escape. They just keep on asking for more and more documents. Now the story jumps forward a little bit, just for a moment, to the 1970s, so about 30 years after the war. And I mentioned to you that like from around this time up until now, the French have been in the process of rethinking the way in which they look back at the war and how they treated those who were, or how they even thought about those who might have been collaborators, right? Because lots of people who collaborated with the Germans or who pretended not to take any side, right, were sort of like the French, it seemed, were in denial of their collaboration, a lot of them, with the Germans. Right? So from the 70s on, new histories, new ways of thinking about it, new ways of confronting the collaboration and the ways in which the French had not resisted the Nazis starts to be written about. But nonetheless, there's this one author, unnamed, who goes back. He finds the story about Marcel, and in his book, he projects his own imagination onto the situation. He knows that Bernard and Marcel are friends, and he says, oh, because they're friends, well, they must have secretly worked together for the resistance, and Marcel must have been a good guy working on the inside to help, right? And so he imagines all these things, and of course, we know that this is not really true, right? We know that Bernard and Marcel are not secretly close brothers and friends. Right. Now we see then Manlius. Manlius, as we mentioned last time, we could see it coming, right? We could see it coming in his meeting with Gundobad that Felix is going to be a problem, right? Because of the situation they're in. So Manlius and Felix, they're openly in conflict now because of the deal with Gundobad. And the second thing that Manlius finds out is that the town of Vaison has openly rebelled against him, right? They're like, we don't want anything to do with Gundobad. We don't want anything to do with the barbarians. We are revolting against you. Now, in the meantime, while Manlius has been away, his adopted son, Syagrius, has been taking lessons from Sophia. And if you remember that when we were first introduced to Syagrius, why did Manlius pick this guy? Why did he adopt him as his son? Yeah, he was very handsome, right? And he thought, well, someone this handsome must also be quite intelligent. And Manlius very quickly finds out, yeah, this guy's not so smart, right? And Sophia, as good a teacher as she is, she also finds out the same thing, right? She can't get Syagrius to think about more complicated sort of questions or problems in philosophy, and he's sort of just too limited, too brainwashed, too stupid to really get what she is trying to say to him. So if you remember from the beginning of the book as well, the dinner party that Manlius holds, in which he invites both his friends and also some other people who are not really his friends, but are his allies at the beginning of the book. One of his chief enemies / friends from the beginning was Caius Valerius, right? Remember, he was sort of like the crude guy that he doesn't like, who sort of like doesn't read and is quite uneducated. And he's the one that leads the revolt, and his plan is to capture Sophia and use her as a sort of a weapon against Manlius, like knowing that she and Manlius are close. But luckily for Sophia, Syagrius he gets to her first, and he takes her to a church and he barricades her in there. Keep her safe. We jump back to Olivier's time, right? The Comte de Frejus, as we see, Isabelle's husband, murders her, but then he immediately says, "Oh, the Jews did it. Oh, my wife, my poor wife. Oh, she's been murdered. Oh, who could have done that?" And then he runs away to a different part of France because he knows that his part in the conspiracy of Chichani, right? Remember, he was involved in like the conspiracy that Chichani has to destabilize Avignon so that he can move the papacy back to Rome. Right? So he flees, gets out of there. Now we see then Julien, who is sort of, we've seen he's still kind of doing his studies at the same time as he's doing his other things. He remembers some documents that he saw about the death of Isabel, and he writes to Rome and says, "Can you send me the documents?" And these were documents that almost 20 years before he had been going to look at, and instead he'd gone to a long lunch with Claude Bronson. And so he misses out on this bit of evidence that he'd missed a long time earlier that tells him that it wasn't Olivier who killed Isabel, confirms this for him. Right? But still, he doesn't know, well, then, why was Olivier then attacked by Chichani's people? Right? Because remember, in the official version, like the fake version of Olivier's life, he kills Isabel out of some sort of jealousy, right? And then in turn, like, he is beaten up and disfigured for killing her, right? But he didn't kill Isabel, so why was he beaten up? Why was he disfigured? Why was he maimed by Chichani's men? That's the question that we don't know yet. Then we see that Julien goes to see Marcel about the 26 people that were arrested, right, who are going to be put to death if he doesn't do anything. And then Marcel tells him, well, you give me Bernard, right? Give me Bernard, and I will trade him as a leader in the resistance. I'll trade him for the 26 people, right? And Julien says, no, I can't do that. And then Marcel goes and makes a phone call, and he comes back and he says, well, you might want to rethink that, because I've just told them to go and arrest Julia. I know she's a Jew. I know she's living here. And if you don't give me Bernard, then I won't release Julia. And Julien, of course, immediately agrees. Right. Also, Marcel tells Julien that, like, Julia's position or her location has been known to him for weeks because it had been reported to him by Elizabeth. Right. Manlius' time again. So Manlius comes back and he approaches the city of Vaison, which has like rebuilt its walls and is rebelling against him. And he is kind of dismayed when he sees that it's Syagrius who comes out to meet him, and he thinks that Syagrius has betrayed him, right? Even though it's not actually true. Like Syagrius is like, oh, just talk to me now and I'll explain things later. But Manlius thinks, oh, he must have betrayed me. But what Syagrius is actually trying to do, the reason that he stayed in the city is that he's trying to protect Sophia, but Manlius doesn't know. So Manlius sends back a strongly worded message back to the city with Syagrius, saying basically surrender or die. I'm going to be entering this town in about an hour, and you can either surrender now or you can face the consequences of my soldiers. And so he starts to send Syagrius back with this message, and then he's like, no. I'm going to send an even more powerful message. And so he calls him back, and he has his soldiers kill Syagrius. Right? And you can imagine, all the townspeople are watching from the walls, and they're seeing, Manlius kill his adopted son. They're like, well, we don't want to mess with this guy, right? Now, on top of that, the other thing that Manlius does is that he has some gifts from King Gundabad, right? And he takes out this, decorated golden box that he has, just decoration, and he comes towards the town gates, and he prays, and he says that, this box contains the relics of Mary Magdalene, right? And so together, these two things, right? On the one hand, Manlius showing that he means business, he's ruthless. He killed his own adopted son, right? So the townspeople are already frightened by how ruthless he is. And on the other hand, he uses the power of religious persuasion to say, I carry the relics of Mary Magdalene in this box. I am, God's chosen leader, right? Even though, of course, Manlius knows it's just an empty box, right? But the town surrenders when they see these two things together. Okay. All right. Now, today the idea that I want to explore is something that almost certainly none of you picked out because it's something very small in our reading for today. But this is The Dream of Scipio. One of the things that, one of the reasons it's one of my all-time favorite novels is that it has so many layers, so many ideas, so many symbols that are contained within it, that even certain small things like the thing I'm going to look at today contains a great deal of meaning and great number of ideas that help us to reflect upon what's happening in the story. So the thing I'm going to look at today is the symbolism of soap, right? You think, where was that mentioned? But remember, Julia, she's been printing all the documents, and she is covered in ink from doing that. And Julian promises her that he'll come back from town, he'll try and get some soap there, right? And there are several other times in the story where during the war, Julian's fate, his key thing is that he's always wants soap. He's always looking to get clean. He's always looking to take a bath or a shower and get clean from soap. Okay. Now, finally, this is just a historical accident. This is not actually because of Ian Pears. That just happens to be his name. But there's a famous brand of soap, right, called Pears soap. Right, and you can see here, this is when, this is actually from some historical documents that I found online about the use of sort of soap as a symbol, right, of the way in which, during the latter parts of the 19th century, the British had, in a very racist, colonizing kind of way, had tried to sort of separate themselves in various ways from their colonial subjects, right? Particularly in places like Africa and so on. And so you can see there, if you read the text, it says, the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pears soap, right? So, and this guy is meant to be he's meant to be sort of a general, a soldier sort of colonial figure as well. Right, so this idea of soap and cleanliness is supposed to be one of those sort of markers, right, civilization, but we can see that the way in which this is presented in a very racist, colonizing sort of way, right? And this is going to be important for how we see this bit of symbolism. Now, this idea about soap as being something that is connected to notions of civilization is not one that begins with this novel and has like a number of other connections that we can see through philosophy, history, etc. So I've put together some quotes, a couple of quotes here, for example, about, from some famous authors and thinkers about thinking about this question of soap. So Sigmund Freud, the famous founder of psychoanalysis, right, one of the most famous figures of the 20th century, right, in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, right, so you can already see he's talking about civilization, right, and he's talking about how is it in our civilization, how do we stop people from having wars? How do we stop, like, us being unhappy and taking that out on other people? So is the central question of that book. And in that book, he makes this same connection. He says, indeed, we are not surprised if someone actually proposes the use of soap as a criterion of civilization. Right? He says, soap for me, right, being clean is one of the ways you can tell the civilized from the barbaric, what Freud says. And then a rather more sarcastic comment is made by this German historian in the 19th century, right, Heinrich von Treitschke, who says the English think soap is civilization, right? And here he's actually being more sarcastic about this idea because he's saying that, because remember, you can probably tell from his name that he's, German, right? And so he's saying here, oh, the English think that being clean is enough to make you civilized, right? And he's saying, no. We Germans, or at least I know that, you actually have to, like, read stuff and be educated and have knowledge and manners and so on. He's implying, right, the English don't have any of those things. They're uncultured, they're uneducated, they're crude, they're barbaric in every way, but they think they're civilized because they use soap, right? Is what Treitschke is saying here. Okay, but I want to make a much darker connection here. And that is through a couple of references in a couple of more recent contemporary novels. Right. First one of them is through the 1969 novel by Kurt Vonnegut, in which he talks about how, and this is, as we'll find out in a moment, is not actually true on any sort of large scale. But there's a passage in there in which he talks about candles and soap being made from human fat. Right. So this quote is from Slaughterhouse-Five. It says, only the candles and soap were of German origin. They had a ghostly, opalescent similarity. The British had no way of knowing it, but the candles and soap were made from the fat of rendered Jews and gypsies and fairies, fairies here being a rather derogatory slang term for homosexuals, and communists and other enemies of the state. And this is from a sort of really an urban myth that about what the Nazis would do. I mean, they did all sorts of horrible things with their prisoners in the concentration camps. But one of the myths that grew up around this was that they were using the human fat, which can be used to make soap and candles and so on, and that they were using this. So this is a sort of a large urban myth that Kurt Vonnegut seems to have unwittingly accepted here. Secondly, is to, and you can see the movie poster here, what's he holding? A bar of soap, right? And if you've seen the movie or if you've read the novel, right, similarly, this same symbolism is used as well, right? So I'm going to have it's a scene in the book and in the novel in which the narrator's hand has lye poured on. Lye is a chemical substance that's also used in the making of soap as well, right? And lye, if you put it on your bare skin, it burns your skin and it will scar your skin, right? So in this scene, like the antagonist, Tyler, has put some lye on his hand and he's forcing his hand to stay there so that he doesn't wash it off, right? And in between, as he's like hurting the main character in this way, he explains about lye and the history of soap, right? And the symbolism, I think, will help you to understand a little more about what Ian Pears' own reference to it is. So let me read the quote to you. It says, "Don't shut this out," Tyler says. "Soap and human sacrifice go hand in hand. In ancient history," Tyler says, "human sacrifices were made on a hill above a river. Thousands of people. Listen to me. The sacrifices were made and the bodies were burned on a pyre. After hundreds of people were sacrificed and burned," Tyler says, "a thick white discharge crept from the altar downhill to the river." Right? So this is like from the human bodies, like the fat and the other things that have come from the dead bodies has gone into the river. Rain, Tyler says, fell on the burnt pyre. Year after year, and year after year, people were burned, and the rain seeped through the wood ashes to become a solution of lye. Right? And the lye, combined with the melted fat of the sacrifices and a thick white discharge of soap, crept out from the base of the altar and crept downhill toward the river. Where the soap fell into the river, Tyler says, after 1,000 years of killing people and rain, the ancient people found their clothes got cleaner if they washed at that spot. You have to see, Tyler says, how the first soap was made of heroes. Think about the animals used in product testing. Think about the monkeys shot into space. Without their death, without their pain, without their sacrifice, Tyler says, we would have nothing. Right? So what this does to explain, right? Of course, this last part is not meant to be taken seriously. It's like sarcastic. Is that we see that like the origins of soap, right, come to us from some kind of death, right? They come to us from, like, soap needs fat, right? Needs, I mean, we could probably make it from vegetable fat these days, but as he's talking about here, the origins of soap lie in, like in this case, the myth that Tyler is telling us is about from its accidental discovery through human sacrifices, which were a central part of some ancient practices, right? So what is he saying here? Right? Why is he doing it? Well, first of all, we can see that soap is not a central symbol in the Dream of Scipio, but it is mentioned a couple of times, and Ian Pears certainly does have a point in mind, this kind of point in mind when he's mentioning it. So as I said today, in today's reading, we see that Julien goes off to Avignon, and he says to Julia, he promised to see if there was any soap or paper to be had. They were, he acknowledged with a smile as he left, the two most valuable things in the world. So I want to suggest that there are at least 3 different ways in which we can understand this symbol. Right? One is the first way that we've seen, which is from the Pears soap advertisement, the quotes from Freud and Treitschke and so on, and it's this identification of soap with civilization, right? That there are certain practices that we've seen that we associate with being civilized, right? So, for example, education is something that we might associate with civilization. Having a rule of law and a political system is a a mark of civilization. And here, another one being proposed is that of physical cleanliness, of soap, right, as being a marker of civilization. So that's one way, that's one possible way of reading this. And we've already seen that like the question about what civilization is and what its value is and so on is really an important part of the dream of Scipio, right? Think back, for example, to the Last Supper that Claude Bronson has. What is he celebrating? Well, he does mention Passover, but he says that the theme of his party is the end of civilization, right? So he points out all the wonderful bounty that they have, like the food that they have and the wine that they have, and right, everything that they have at this party is the product of civilization, including, remember, their ability to get together and gossip and chat and talk about things, right? So he says, like, this party is the culmination of civilization. It's been provided for us by civilization, but he argues that also it's the end, as far as he's concerned, of civilization, right? That those things that made civilization possible, he thinks are disappearing and falling apart. Okay, so one way to read this symbol of soap is that it's through this symbol of civilization. A second way of reading this, right, is that, as I mentioned and you saw in the Kurt Vonnegut quotation, there is this widespread, really mostly urban myth that the Nazis used their victims in the concentration camps to create soap on a large scale. It's actually not true, right? But this idea, as you can see, even in an author and in a book as famous as Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, still has references to this myth. Now, it's not true that the Nazis did this on a mass scale, but they did. There is some evidence that they did actually experiment with doing this. So there are some existing like bars of soap and so on that are actually made from human remains, right? So there is some historical evidence that they did this on, like they experimented with this, but they never actually did it on a large scale. So you can see if we put together, right, these two different ways of looking at the question of soap, if we put those two things together, then I think we really get to a third interpretation that I think really is the one that Ian Pears is going for, right? Which is that on the one hand, if we see soap as a symbol of civilization, right, then we also have to take into account the second part, that that civilization emerges from or is built upon cruelty, bloodshed, injustice, right? That it comes from those things and it's inseparable from them, right? So the traditional way, as we've seen, of thinking about like civilization and barbarism, right, is that they are just completely separate, right? So like think about Manlius's time, right? There's the Roman Empire and then there's the barbarians, right? The Romans have this like long-standing set of cultural traditions and literary traditions and artistic and architectural and military and political, like this whole set of traditions that are part of their civilized culture, right? And so anyone who doesn't share those or who doesn't have a similar kind of civilization as far as the Romans are concerned, right, is seen by them as barbaric, uneducated, crude, uncivilized. Okay. So that's how the Romans, and earlier before them, the guys who invented this term, the Greeks, saw this question of civilization versus barbarism. But we've come over time to shift these ideas in a kind of a different direction, right? That we've started to see civilization as not being, as being more a question of sort of like behavior, right? Rather than of having a sort of certain kind of social structure as the Greeks and Romans saw it. So the the argument that I'm saying that I think underlies this, that I think Ian Pears seems to be making in this book, at least according to my interpretation, right, is that he's getting us to rethink our idea of civilization. Right? He's getting us to rethink that sort of easy black and white division between civilization and barbarism, of being like kind and sophisticated and educated on the one hand, and cruel and vicious and lawless on the other. And saying, well, actually, civilization is not only formed out of acts of cruelty and injustice and bloodshed, right, but it actually relies upon these continuing things to keep happening, right, in order to maintain civilization, right? That there is a kind of sacrifice, as it were, that goes on that makes civilization possible for others, right? So these, as I said, these are sort of three different ways of looking at this question. Number one, the idea of civilization as soap as being an indicator, one of the marks of a civilized people, you could argue is physical cleanliness of soap, right? It would exclude a hell of a lot of even Western civilization if you did that, but nonetheless, right? Secondly, we could see it in the context of that very horrible idea, myth about the connection between human sacrifice and or the concentration camps and the production of humans as soap, but then put together symbolically, we could see soap as being an argument, not that not about that the Nazi myth about soap was actually, or mass-produced soap was real, but rather that civilization rests upon some kind of injustice, some kind of cruelty, some kind of bloodshed. And that there really isn't a civilization that doesn't have this as part of its past and even probably part of its current present. Okay, guys, thank you. Enjoy your weekend. As I said, on Monday, we will talk about the final exam, and I'll give you the questions, and we'll go over the strategies again. That's something to look forward to, huh? Yeah. All right. Okay, thank you.